Good afternoon and welcome to the Colorado Health Foundation's Activating Places and Spaces Together Funding Opportunity webinar. My name is Amy Strajewski and I'm the Communications Associate here at the Foundation, as well as your chairperson for today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get started with some housekeeping notes. Our webinar today is being recorded so that others who could not attend can watch the presentation later. Tomorrow you will receive a link to this recording, as well as the PDF presentation that we will go over today. We'll also post the recording and the presentation on our website at www.coloradohealth.org. In order to minimize background noise, your phones will be muted in a listen-only mode during the presentation. The final portion of our webinar is devoted to questions, so please feel free to send your questions via the chat function at any time during the presentation. You should see a chat dialog area located on the lower left-hand side of your screen, where you may type and send questions. You will also see a raise hand button, which we will not be using, so you don't need to click it when asking a question. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please call ReadyTalk's toll-free technical support number at 1-800-843-9166. Make sure to have your registration confirmation available. Finally, after the webinar has concluded, you will have the opportunity to give us feedback through a short survey. We ask you to take a minute and complete the survey, which helps us to improve our future presentations. And with that, I'll turn the conference over to Chris Smith, Senior Program Officer for Healthy Living at the Colorado Health Foundation.
So anyway, my name is Chris Smith. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Colorado Health Foundation, and I am on our Healthy Living team. Today we're going to talk about a relatively new funding opportunity that the Health Foundation has created called Activating Spaces and Places Together. We'll do a presentation which covers a bit about the Colorado Health Foundation, since we may have some new folks on the call who are not as familiar with the Health Foundation. And then we'll go through the funding opportunity itself, and then once again, as I mentioned, leave some questions at the end, time at the end for you to be able to ask your questions. And hopefully we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you have. If you have any other questions that we can't get to during this presentation, we will address them following the presentation through email or posting it onto our website. So let's get started. About the Colorado Health Foundation. The Colorado Health Foundation has the vision that together will make Colorado healthiest state in the nation. We do that by investing in 3 community outcome areas. The 2 original outcome areas are health care and health coverage. The newer outcome areas is the healthy living area. And we use basically 6 tools. So we focus on looking at leadership and trying to address grant making. We do address policy and that work through our foundation. We focus on communications. We do have a private sector initiatives program, and we look at medical residencies. And ideally, through a combination of all of these efforts, we'll be able to achieve our vision, which is that Colorado will be the healthiest state in the nation. Now, the Healthy Living team, as I mentioned, I'm a member of our Healthy Living team, has a goal that we want for all Colorado children to be fit and healthy. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we focus on a number of different areas, as I mentioned, with the grant making, and we focus on our advocacy, and we focus on our awareness and working through organizations. And one of the ways that we work through those organizations is through our funding opportunities. The funding opportunity that we want to talk about today is the Activating Spaces and Places Together. So now what does that mean? Well, the goal of this funding opportunity first is to help activate existing infrastructure. So if we think of public spaces in communities that contribute greatly to the health of a community. If you go and listen to any sort of discussions about community health, you'll find that while the numbers may slightly, the percentages may slightly vary, you find that somewhere in the area about 70% of a person's health is really directly related to their environment and the behaviors that they adapt in response to that environment. So the connection between a community and its overall sense of place, and how residents in those communities use that place has a large impact on the health of the individuals that live in that community. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to focus on how we engage in public places and try to make sure that they result in resident usage amongst the residents that live in those communities, and ideally reinforce positive experiences for those residents. So this proposal does focus on local. It has an emphasis on local, and we are focusing, as I mentioned earlier, on place. And our goal here is simply to get people outdoors and get them to be actively engaged in their neighborhoods. But we want to be able to do that as part of an overall community. So that's why we talk about activating spaces and places together. So the grant funds from this funding opportunity are going to be available to support program and project costs, and we will look at planning and or implementation proposals and proposals that go for up to 1 year. Now, what we will fund through the Activating Spaces and Places Together is, as I mentioned, planning and or implementation for up to 1 year. We are looking for, we are able to fund infrastructure enhancements. Now, one of the things that we have gotten in our previous round is we did get some interest for people wanting to sort of do more heavy sort of building things in place. One way that I like to describe this funding opportunity is to think people rather than to think things. Even though we're focused on activating places, we don't see, we want to see activation as getting people to come out in a user space. So to some extent, enhancements of existing infrastructure, that could be through beautification, it could be through information and wayfinding, it could be through cleanup, it could be through any sort of means that draw people to a place. But what we're not trying to do through this funding opportunity is actually build infrastructure. We want to use what we already have in place. And we want to work with communities to say, how can we take advantage of what we already have invested in and really utilize to their best benefit for the community? Another thing that we will fund is the related administrative costs for doing that. So through this funding opportunity, we're not asking you to do this planning and or implementation and not be able to capture any administrative costs related to those efforts. So we will allow for administrative costs related to these activation efforts. We will allow for community outreach and coordination, because a big part of this funding opportunity is really engaging with your communities, in a very meaningful sort of way. And that takes time and it takes effort, and we want to make sure that we are allocating sufficient funds in our grant awards and even in your proposals, when you're thinking about your proposals, that you're allowing for sufficient community outreach and coordination. And then also technical assistance for community engagement, communications, et cetera. In doing this kind of planning and or implementation, some folks may need to have some assistance in being able to do that type of engagement well, and we want to make sure that we're supporting their efforts to be able to do that effectively. Now, examples of what we're talking about when we say activating places and spaces together, what kind of activities could the community decide that they're going to engage in? Well, it's really kind of challenging for us to say exactly what we are going to, what a community could propose, because you talk to any given community and they could come up with any number of things that they want to do in terms of activation. And so we have a couple of examples, but these are not something for you to limit your efforts to. It simply is to give you an idea of what's possible. So you can look at potentially movies, or it could be concerts in the parks or something like that, something that would draw people out into the park. Or maybe it's a walking or a running club, something along those lines. Or as I mentioned earlier, it could be a stewardship or a community beautification. You know, people are very familiar with this idea of these friends of the whatever it is. You know, it could be the river, friends of the park, or what have you. But it's things that get people out and engaged. So that's not the extent of what we're going to fund, obviously, but those are just some ideas that you could think about when you're considering what it is that you would fund. What we also would like for you to consider when you're putting together your proposals or thinking about your response here is that, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of enhancements to existing infrastructure. So we want to work with things that are already existing, and our goal here is to just simply to enhance that to some extent. We don't want to necessarily build new. That's not what we're trying to do here, but we're trying to really make what we have, you know, more attractive and to people so that they'll want to come out and use these things. So we could be talking about even sidewalks, you know, something along those lines. How do you get more people walking in your communities? Those are some of the ideas that we're thinking about. Community outreach and participation in planning, design, and implementation of these projects and the programming is crucial to your proposal. So we want to make sure that that engagement and that involvement is real and that it's meaningful. We're not wanting to see you come in, for example, with a proposal that is an idea in search of a community. What we would rather you think about is addressing and working with the community, and through that process developing what that idea is in terms of what it is that you want to do. And by the way, where. So in thinking about your proposals, we want you to consider what you want to do. We want you to consider what the community sees as being an area within the community that they may want to activate. You know, how do they want to improve this place? Maybe there's a vacant lot. Maybe there's a park that's underutilized. Maybe there's a downtown street or something that is not that is not being it's not drawing people. They can't see a reason to go there. Well, what would it take to make that then more attractive, and how could you draw people to that? That's the process that we're hoping to engage in here. And then the communications and the local promotion and public awareness that goes along with making that a successful effort. So some of the things that we learned from our first round, and as I mentioned, I can't recall if I restated this when we started due to the technical problems, but some of the observations from our first round that we had for this Activating Spaces and Places, as I mentioned, this is a new funding opportunity for us. I can't sort of overstate the importance that for the Health Foundation, we're trying something different. You know, everybody knows us on the Healthy Living team as healthy eating and active living. And we're still healthy eating and active living on the Healthy Living team. However, we recognize that for a lot of people, you know, getting to that stage of eating healthy foods and what have you, or access to healthy foods, or getting access and using opportunities to be physically active, for many folks, there's barriers to them being able to do that, and those can be real or perceived barriers. And so we understand that there's a step that goes before getting to moderate and vigorous levels of physical activity, for instance, or there's a step that goes before being able to have access to healthy food. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, how do we fill that gap here and then provide a sort of a lower level threshold to getting folks just engaged and getting them back involved with being engaged in their community. But one of the things that we learned is that we've, in a sense, I think we've done, we're known so much for our efforts around increased physical activity and food that some of the proposals that we got were very much focused on just increased physical activity and food. And while we're not going to say that you can't propose that, that's not the only thing that you can propose in order to get people involved and sort of frame what you could possibly do in terms of activating a space or a place. We will look at proposals that are both indoor and outdoor. We got a few of each. The variety, I think, is important in terms of whether, we'd like to see a balance. They could be indoor programs and outdoor projects in terms of activation. We did get diversity. Geographically, we got projects and proposals from all over the state of Colorado, which was really great. And we did get a number of different sort of approaches to what we were trying to do. So I want to give you a couple of examples that came out of some of our experience that led to the development of this funding opportunity. And one example came from the city of Lamar in southeastern Colorado. And if you're not familiar, Lamar is a rural community in southeastern Colorado. And one of the things that they looked at in trying to activate Lamar was along their main street. And so they saw an opportunity to take a vacant lot that was existing in the downtown area between a couple of buildings and tried to figure out how could they turn that into something more than sort of a vacant lot. And how could they turn it not just activating for one spot moment, and that's a key point I think that I want to make sure that we communicate here, is that when we're talking about activation, activation is not sort of like a one-time thing. You do it and then you sort of forget about it and nothing happens for another year. Our goal is to try to say that to really, truly activate a place, you have to come up with a series of program activities that happen over the course of the year for as long as possible in order to get people to be able to really engage in that place. And so what Lamar did is they really worked on coming up with how they could turn this vacant lot into a park. So for them, this Bicentennial Park is something that the community worked together to come up with an idea for how could they turn this space into something that would be much more attractive and usable for people in their community. Or we have the example in Westwood. This neighborhood has been going through a lot of transitions recently, and one of the challenges that they had in the Westwood neighborhood in talking to the community was this issue of alleys. They had alleys, and the alleys were a place where people would go to dump trash, and they really just were not, an attractive or safe place. And on top of that, a number of children would use the alleys as a way to walk to school. Which in many respects you'd say, okay, this is an ideal sort of a thing. Kids have an easy way to be able to walk to school. Why wouldn't we want to encourage that? But, they're walking through an alley that's, junky and dangerous, and the question was, how could they turn that into a place that would be more attractive for kids? So in working with the kids, they came up with a concept for remodeling the alleys, rethinking the alleys, turning them into a place that somebody may want to actually walk down, and really engaging the kids in that process of sort of revisioning what these alleys could be. And they've done a really great job of sort of turning something that was formerly an eyesore into something that really is an attraction for their community. And then in Arvada, this was is a neighborhood just outside of Denver, the northwestern border of Denver, and it's a suburban community. And what Arvada wanted to do was to try to better utilize some of the resource that they already had in terms of their trails and figure out how could they try to get people to move around Arvada through bikes or walking and figure out a way to really encourage them to do that. And one of the things that they came up with was wayfinding. And if you haven't heard of this term of wayfinding, it's really sort of signage that you would put along these routes that tells people how long is it going to take to get from one place to the other. Or maybe I'm traveling from one place to the other and I didn't know, by the way, that a park is so close here, or maybe the library is off of that. And so how do I get there? This gives you more sense of not only that you're on the trail to begin with. If you're riding along a trail or walking along a trail, you really don't know where it leads to. This gives you a better sense of where it's going, but it also tells you what's coming and what's next. So they use this idea of activation, and then also placing bike racks along the trail to give more of a sense of if you're going to ride your bike along the street, you have a place now that you could stop and rest and maybe park your bike. And that might be an example of a sort of enhancement, sort of a small-scale enhancement. And we're not talking about huge amounts of money here, but the sort of thing that makes that activation, which is actually getting people on the trail. Remember I was saying more focused on people than it is on stuff, and doing that and actually drawing folks to use these sort of resources. And you get the sort of infrastructure improvements that you make, just those little things that you need to kind of take this place and sort of put it over the top and make it really a draw for people. So what are some of the eligibility requirements for this funding opportunity? Well, one, you can go to the Foundation's website and you can see that in order to be eligible, you have to be a nonprofit organization. I'm not going to go through all of the details of eligibility here, but it's available on our website, and it will tell you everything that you need to know in order to be eligible to apply for this funding opportunity. The next thing is that you must be a group or an organization that has experience working in the community. What we're not trying to encourage, and hope, or maybe what we hope to discourage, is we're not looking for organizations that sort of are dropping out of the sky in a community and said, hey, you over there, we're going to activate your community. That's not what we're trying to do. We really want to say for organizations that have spent time working in a community and really have gotten to know the people that they're working with and can more easily sort of move into this dialogue, engaging the community and talk about what it would take to sort of improve the health of the residents. We want those kind of relationships. So bring those sort of organizations that have experience working with the communities that you're looking to try to do a project with. And then our emphasis as part of our healthy living goal, as I mentioned, is all Colorado kids are fit and healthy, is we want to make sure that the emphasis for this program is on youth from high need and low-income communities. We want to, one of the ways that we're going to look at determining this idea of high need, low income is we're going to look at the eligibility for free and reduced school meals. We'll look at average family income and other indicators of need that we'll take into consideration. But we want to make sure that you're serving youth first, and then we'll look at the emphasis should be on youth that have high need and lower income. And then the infrastructure, as I mentioned, for activation, it must be already in place. So we're not trying to build new things. I won't say that for the 100th time. I think we've covered that fairly well now. But then also the infrastructure that you may look at proposing for activation, this is key, it must be publicly owned, because remember what we're talking about activation here, it's for the community, it has to be publicly accessible. Now that doesn't mean that you can't look at something that is privately owned, but if you do consider something that is privately owned, you must have some sort of agreement in place that ensures that access to the public is possible to the extent that it is essentially a publicly accessible facility. So keep that in mind. It's either public or it has to be accessible through some sort of an agreement that makes sure that that's the case. And then this infrastructure for activation, it has to be able to be open to walkable, it has to be bikeable. People have to be able to get there, and it can't just be sort of thing like, well, if you can drive there, you can get there. And then the other thing is that, it has to be contiguous. So like if you're thinking about trails or sidewalks or something along those, they have to be connected together. It doesn't have to be one specific place, but if it is multiple sort of places, they have to be connected in some sort of way, and those linkages have to be public. They have to be walkable, bikeable, accessible, access ways. Now, continuing on the eligibility requirements, we're going to talk about the proposed activation effort must have demonstrated support of the surrounding community. I've talked about this idea that we want to make sure that this is something that the community is saying that they see as being a priority. And that is the place or the space, and then the what we're doing to activate it. So be careful about this idea of having a program that you're then trying to apply to a place or a space. Because while that may be important from the standpoint of your organization, it's something that you do. Is it and one of the questions is it something that the community that you're working with has said, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to focus on? We want to make sure that that's the emphasis that's being placed on this. Now, the activation efforts must target youth, as I talked about. So who are we talking about? We're saying pre-K through the 12th grade. That's our emphasis. That's our focus. It doesn't mean it can't go outside of that, but this is our focus here, and we want to make sure that we're reaching their families also. The proposed activation effort must be relevant and appropriate to the needs and interests of the youth served. So it's no good, right, to have a area, a place, or to have a program, an activation. This is what you're going to try to do, and the community is sort of, has expressed no interest in that. There's no results to suggest that activating that place, that park, for instance, that you have. Well, why aren't people using it? Well, do people, are people attracted to that park or that program that you're looking to run? Well, who said that that's what they want to actually do in that place? Those are the kind of things. We want to make sure that they're relevant and that they're appropriate for the needs and interests of the group that you're trying to work with. And then you as an organization, we want to make sure that you're demonstrating sufficient capacity and to be able to not only plan and implement what you're trying to do, but to also use that sort of technical support that we're talking about for these activities if you choose to do so. And then proposals that, they need to also engage and support commitments from local governments. So, for example, if you're looking to activate a park and you're looking to do activities in a park space or something like that, and that community that you're working in requires permits in order to be able to do that, we want to make sure that you're having that dialogue and having that conversation with your local government to make sure that you're able to do that. And even if it's not a park, right, I think ideally that way of engaging with your local government and getting them on board and involved is a great way to go about enhancing what you're trying to do and making sure that this is a community goal and it's not just your organization that you're in one neighborhood. We're trying to make sure that this goes beyond just simply one organization, one neighborhood or one community. And then we want to make sure that you're considering the long-term sustainability of what you're trying to propose. This activating spaces and places together funding opportunity is really kind of like the match, so to speak, the kind of the catalyst to get it going. But it's not intended to sustain these things for long term. However, we do believe that if you work with your community and identify those kind of activation proposals that really have a lot of interest from the local community, that over time you'll look at how the community can sustain those things moving forward. We're willing to help get started, but the intent is not to sort of fund for perpetuity. So here's our theory of change here. I think it's a little dense for this particular webinar, so I won't spend a lot of time on there. But if you look back and look at this webinar, you'll be able to see what we're thinking about the actions that we feel will drive change, what the preconditions are, and then really where we're trying to get to here, which is really increased utilization of the built environment, of the public environment, and the assets that are existing in that community by children and their families. So that's our target. That's the goal that we're shooting for here. So with that, I think I've gone about as quickly as I can move through this whole thing. I'm sure you have questions, and we welcome those. So why don't we get into those questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So we have a few questions that have come through, and the first one actually speaks to what you were just talking about. Sarah asks, I'm curious about the one-year limit on this funding program. Many of the kinds of projects and programs you describe would benefit from multi-year planning and engagement. Do you anticipate awarding renewal grants in future years?
Yeah, so we have thus far, as I mentioned, this is still a new funding opportunity. And so until we can learn more, really at the end of this year, after our third cycle, and we revisit what kind of proposals that we're receiving and what people are looking at doing, the intention here is to focus on these one-year grants. So that's where we're starting. We don't know yet if the idea of extending that 1 year is something that we're going to do. But we will reevaluate what this funding opportunity is in terms of its structure at the end of this year. As it currently states, we are not looking at renewals for this. As I mentioned, it's really more of this sort of catalytic getting this work started. And then when we get, as I mentioned, when we get to the end of the year, we'll make a more informed decision after we have these 3 funding cycles from the first year out in terms of what this funding opportunity, how it might evolve into the second year.
Great. And the next question is, could you provide some examples of health outcomes other than increased physical activity and improvements in food and nutrition that these projects might accomplish?
Sure. So our health outcomes, if you look at our application, and this is one of the things that I think came out of our first round for this funding cycle, that we may look at editing our application to address the measurable results, because as many of you are familiar with, the measurable results for healthy living are increased consumption of fruits and vegetables and increased levels of physical activity, moderate and vigorous. So the health outcomes that we're looking at as it relates to activation, in a sense, continue to sort of rely upon that kind of increased consumption and increased physical activity. But I want to take a step back and say that this funding opportunity does not require that you achieve those specific outcomes for this activating places and spaces. So really instead, what we're looking at more of is engagement of the community. It's this idea of bringing folks together, and this idea of saying the health benefits of getting people that maybe had barriers, that they weren't going out, they weren't using some of these spaces and places, they weren't using these resources that are available in the community. So just the positive sort of benefit of getting out and being engaged with those things and feeling comfortable doing that before we get to this whole idea of, okay, so how vigorously are you using that space, for example, in terms of something along the physical activity side. So don't concentrate too much on trying to increase that level of physical activity or consuming sort of healthy fruits and vegetables. I'm not going to tell you don't do that, but that's not going to be the way that we grade sort of the outcomes here. What we're really looking at is how are you involving your community? How are they being drawn to this activation, and are you showing progress in terms of bringing people and getting them engaged in what you're proposing to do?
Great, thank you. And so we've had several questions about the funding amount. So Kendra asks, can you please review the amount of funding you're offering and the options to use this money to match other sources of funding to reach projects you need?
Sure. Absolutely. So the funding amount, the funding range that we've set for this funding opportunity is from $15,000 on the low end to $100,000. That's the range that we're working with. We do not have a match requirement, and you may use this funding opportunity. If you were to be successful and receive a grant through this activating spaces and places together, you may use that as leverage for funding through another organization and another source.
Great. To follow up on that, what percentage can cover administrative costs, and when would funding begin?
Well, we haven't placed a hard limit on the percentage that would cover administrative costs. But the only thing that I would suggest that you keep in mind as it relates to this funding opportunity, that the intent here is to bring people out and get them engaged. Now, for some projects to do that, the oversight, the administrative costs on that could be relatively minor, right? Because it depends on how many people are necessary in order to be able to draw folks out into the community. And to use a particular resource. For another community that maybe has a more involved program, there may be a justification for involving more people. I think you have to consider reasonableness here. The intent is to try as many things as possible that will help to increase activation of underutilized resources in your community. The intent is to not try to fund as many sort of people as possible. So I think you have to kind of consider the level of administrative costs and keep that in mind relative to the amount that is actually going to the programming that you're trying to do, and make sure that you're not that when you put that proposal together, that it's got a reasonable balance in there. We're not trying to just sort of say fund a position and, well, what is the activation going to be? Well, that's not really very well defined, but we're looking to fund a position. Kind of keep that in mind.
Great. And the next question is, could this funding support the resurrection or renewal of a previous program?
Well, I think that gets back to the question of, have you engaged the community, and has that community said that this place, that program, is the top priority for what they would like to see in terms of activation? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, and so what you have is a program that had existed for some period of time and then maybe stopped, you may have a program that answers that first question. So you might be able to say, well, yes, this is something that the community really has said that they wanted, and they really wanted in this particular place. Now, what the bigger challenges it raises then is still the question that I mentioned earlier, which is the sustainable part. How is it now going to be sustained? Because as you are thinking about what you're doing, we want to make sure that you're considering how you're going to be sustain what it is that you're doing. If it stops the minute that this grant ends, then I don't think that I think you would have to give a little bit more consideration to how that program could sustain itself into the future. One of the questions may be, what did you learn with that program that may need to change in order for it to be able to sustain itself longer term?
Great, thank you. And a follow-up from a prior question. Emily says, thank you for answering this piece about the admin costs. Would you please answer again when the funding cycle would begin?
Sure. So this funding opportunity is going to be open for each open funding cycle that the Colorado Health Foundation has. And if you are not aware, we have 3 open funding cycles per year. The deadlines are always on the 15th. So February 15th, June 15th, and October 15th. So we had our first cycle, which was this past February. This June will be June 15th, which will be our second open funding cycle. And you would be eligible to apply. We're trying this program, but we're going to run this funding opportunity for 3 years, 3 cycles for 3 years.
Thanks. And our next question from Lynn is, can applications be submitted jointly through 2 or more organizations? Does one organization need to take the lead for submission?
The application can be submitted jointly. What we want to make sure is that if you do submit the application jointly, we want to make sure that both organizations are eligible to apply. I mean, that's something to keep in mind. But yes, you could submit a joint application.
Great. And Jeannie asks, can this funding be applied to keep a pilot program going?
Possibly. And I think and the only reason why I qualified that way is because, once again, we go back to this question of, is there evidence that the level of community engagement has been completed, whereas the program itself, or the level of what it is that you're doing to activate, and the community have sort of said, out of all of the things that we want to try to address in this community, this is the thing that we really want to address, and that they've indicated this as a priority. So I think that those two parts are key in determining whether or not this funding opportunity is appropriate.
Great. And to go back a little bit to the timing question, Carrie asks, how long is the process after June 15th until funds are awarded?
Absolutely. Thinking positive. So from the 15th, the easiest way that I can describe the timeline to you is say that the application, from the application deadline, the review to award process generally takes about 4 months. So the way the shorthand way I describe it to folks is that if you were to apply in June, we generally make decisions by the next deadline, by the upcoming deadline, so that would be in October. Now, we could make a decision sooner than that, and we certainly endeavor to do that. And that decision could be, it could be a declination. We could choose to decline that, or we could choose to approve that. And that we do try to make those decisions if we are looking at something that would be not something that we could fund. We generally will look to try to do that as quickly as possible. But the decision-making, does have to go through our due diligence, and we do need to understand as much as we can about it. So generally, it takes about 4 months.
Okay, great. And another question from Carrie. Could the funding be used to extend a walking trail?
Well, see, that would be building infrastructure. And so that wouldn't necessarily, that wouldn't be really an ideal use for this, because once again, this is now, you're building more infrastructure, and that's not really the emphasis and the intent of what this funding opportunity is.
Okay. And I have a longer question from Maria. It's probably for your comments more than anything else. So she says, hello, Chris. We've been running the Museum of Friends for 11 years. And for the last 4, we've worked on downtown beautification with planter boxes and at-risk youth, many of whom are obese. About 8 years ago, Electra Fowler began the Riverwalk project with youth. It started out great, but petered out. I and Brent Berger are public artists and muralists. We would like to propose a comprehensive beautification project with youth on murals, more planter boxes, and reigniting the Riverwalk project depending on the season. We would need advocacy help to organize the local healthy living coordinator to understand the power of art, community, and public spaces. This is not an easily understood concept in Walsenburg, La Veta, and Gardner. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this webinar.
Sure. So that's a pretty involved question there. So I think the best way for me to answer that is probably to do that through an email. And at the end of this presentation, you'll see the email from you'll see my email address. And by the way, for anybody out there, I'm happy to answer these questions as we did from the previous webinar for the first cycle. I received a number of questions, and I will definitely respond to that. But I don't want to get too sort of specific on your proposal, but I'm happy to answer that question. I would just suggest that maybe you just send that to me, and we respond that way.
Great. So a couple more questions. The first one is, would partnering with another organization that serves more youth make an organization eligible to apply?
I think that you pick the partners that you feel are the most appropriate partners to be able to prepare the best proposal. The only caution that I would place in the partners is that in terms of who you choose to work with, is just keep in mind that this isn't a sort of about this funding opportunity isn't about sort of show as many partners as possible. You want to pick the partners that really are most necessary for you to do the best proposal and no more. Because it's challenging enough, I think, to work with partners and to do that effectively. And we don't want you to commit to having all of these folks involved, if that's not what you're really able to do. So just consider that when you're selecting. But if your organization, for instance, does not really focus on you, and you see that this funding opportunity does, and you feel like a partnership with an organization that has that sort of a background will enhance what you're trying to do and make it more reasonable. Why is, say, organization A trying to do this project if they really don't work with kids? Well, they've got partner organization B that has that background, then yes, that makes a lot of sense, and it probably would be appropriate for that organization A to apply.
Great, and we have one more question that's come through. So just as a reminder to everyone, we have about 8 minutes left. So if you have any final questions, please submit them via the chat feature. So Lynn asks, if the activity in our proposal is most conducive to the summer months, should we consider which funding cycle to apply to?
No, the funding cycle does not influence what what you're trying to propose. So, like for instance, when you choose to come in with an application is simply when you choose to come in with the application. I'd say that the primary driver for when you choose to apply, more than anything else, the primary driver is that you are ready to apply. That's the most important thing. In terms of your activity, keep in mind that we are trying to activate for as long as possible, because in order to really draw folks out and have them be engaged, we're trying to really make these places viable, attractive places for residents, and we want to do that for as long as possible. And so if you have a program that really just is like a summertime program and then it ends, the question is, well, what happens after that? I mean, does that alley, for instance, that vacant lot in Lamar turn back into a vacant lot simply because there's nothing going on in the fall or in springtime? We all understand the challenges of having activated outdoor places in Colorado in the winter. I mean, but, and a whole other crowd would say, what are you talking about? That's the most active time of the year. So I think you have to keep in mind the activities could potentially change to respond to the seasons. And that's the kind of activation that we're hoping to sort of see. So it really depends, and try to be creative as possible to say, what could we possibly do that sort of extends this for as long as possible?
Great, and just one more follow-up question. Could you reiterate the range of funding per project?
Sure, $15,000 to $100,000.
Thanks, and then a more specific question.
Yep.
Our nonprofit is newly formed, and we are still awaiting our 501c3 approval.
Okay.
Should be no later than mid-June.
Yep.
Your online application process asks for an EIN, which, when provided, is not recognized. I assume this is because we are still awaiting our 501c3 status. Is there a way we can still apply by June, or will we have to wait until the October application period?
Okay, so that's a rather technical question. And so I appreciate you asking it, but I think the best form for addressing and answering that question, because I don't want to tell you something that's not correct, would be to handle that through an email. So when we conclude, I'll show the slide that has my email address on it, and I would suggest that you just send that question to me, and then what I will do is make sure that you get the correct answer.
Great. Well, at this point, we don't have any other. Oh, we do have one more question. So our last question is, are fiscal sponsorships allowed? I apologize if I missed this, if it was already mentioned.
Yes, the Colorado Health Foundation does allow for fiscal sponsors. You would go to our website for, once again, technical kind of question. I'm forgetting the exact term there. But on our website, under the grant making, you'll find a frequently asked questions page, which will answer your question about what is required if you choose to work with a fiscal sponsor.
Great. So at this point, we don't have any further questions. So Chris, I'll kick it to you to go to your next slide with your contact info and any final thoughts, and then I'll wrap it up.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate you all joining us this afternoon. I always love to do these webinars. I hope I answered many of your questions. I hope you find this funding opportunity interesting, and hope you appreciate that we're with the Health Foundation, we're trying to sort of see how we can sort of expand the scope of what communities are trying to do, because this challenge of trying to help improve community health is something that's going to take a lot of effort, and we have to try a lot of different things to see how we can be successful. And one of the first ones is just getting people to get out there and be involved. And so consider that when you're looking at this funding opportunity. If you have any questions, as I mentioned, further questions, you just send them to me. You see my email address there, CA Smith. You got to remember to put that A in there. Some people forget to put the A in there, and unfortunately, I don't get those emails. So CA Smith at coloradohealth.org, or you see my phone number 303-953-3661. Once again, thanks for joining us, and you all have a good afternoon.
Yep, and just as a quick reminder, tomorrow all participants will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording. And then we will also be posting a list of our most frequently asked questions for this funding opportunity on our website this week. So if you have anything that popped up that you'd like to refer back to, go ahead and visit our website. And then also don't forget to complete the short survey that will be available on your screen after we end the webinar. Your feedback really helps us to improve our future presentations. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.